Hi guys, Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT Union, spoke to James O'Brien about a number of issues. But in this part of the interview, the trade unionist was asked about the European Union. The RMT advised its members back in 2016 to vote to leave, and Mick Lynch today still supports Brexit. Now, I have a huge amount of respect for Mick. I think he's probably the greatest voice workers have at the moment. He's also leading the charge when it comes to saying enough is enough to the Tory government that wants to drive more and more people into poverty. Now, I do not want to take anything away from this great individual who's doing amazing work for ordinary people. But when talking about the EU and Brexit, Mick is sadly wrong. Have a listen.
Colin is in Windsor. Colin, what would you like to ask Mick?
Good morning, James. Good morning, Mick. And Mick Lynch, fantastic work. I've been so impressed with what you've done over the last few months.
Thank you.
My question is, do you believe that British workers' rights will be enhanced or weakened by us leaving the EU?
Well, in terms of the most of the legislation that we've got that is not inherited from the EU, it's mainly the Working Time Directive, which we implemented as a 48-hour week, would you believe? So it's a very diluted version of what come. But it's up to the government at Westminster whether they want to change those laws. All of the laws that we had inside the EU are now written in, copied straight into British legislation. So if you want to change any of those laws for better or worse, you now have a sovereign right to do that. If you're in the EU, you can't. But
actually, no, that's not true. Before I get to the sovereign part, he says here that if you're a member of the European Union, you can't change those laws. Now, at the beginning, he said none of these laws, or very few of these laws, are actually UK laws. So now he's saying that you can't change EU laws. I presume he's talking about employment. So is it that there are EU laws or there aren't EU laws? And of course, you can change them because if you have members representing your country in the European Parliament, they are the ones who can change the laws. But now back to the point of, well, if you're a sovereign country, now you can change the laws. Yes, but you can also get rid of them. You can get rid of protections, which is exactly what the Tories are doing here. Now, I believe what Mick believed when he voted for Brexit was he would usher in a Corbyn government, one that is friendly to trade unions and workers. And he didn't expect a Tory government which would tear up the rule book, tear up all protections for workers, and are driving further and further in that direction. But the problem with believing that you'd get a Corbyn government is that the Corbyn government would not last forever. It would be replaced, likely, with a Tory government. And what would the Tories do, as the Tories have always done? Strip away workers' protections. And now that you're outside the European Union, there's no one to back you up. There's no one for you to go to at a higher level and say, look, the government is taking away our rights. Because the buck stops there, in a sense.
if you take the last Corbyn manifesto, which I obviously support, it's likely that that manifesto was illegal under the European Union because...
Now, I don't believe it was illegal, but Mick does seem to believe it was illegal, which implies that Mick believes that Jeremy Corbyn is a Brexiteer, or a Lexiteer, whichever you prefer. Because many people on the left who support Corbyn have said, no, Jeremy Corbyn supported remaining in the European Union. I don't know at this stage, but Mick Lynch seems to think that he didn't support remaining in the European Union.
You cannot go to public ownership of the leading parts of the economy, the railways, energy and the rest of it.
What have they just done in France with EDF?
Well, they've used an emergency power to cap it. The EDF was already...
But within the bounds of EU legislation.
Yeah, they have. But if you take... They haven't got round to the energy. The fourth railway...
No, I had to stop it here because he said it very quickly. They haven't got round to the energy, which he's implying, I presume, that the EU hasn't made it illegal for the French government or other governments to buy parts of this private company, EDF, this energy company. So the EU hasn't gotten round to it yet. That's a very strange way of looking at it, that the EU is overlooking these. The EU doesn't normally overlook these things, especially if it's something big like energy and the ability for the state to buy parts of an energy company. He's sort of implying that the EU is like, I don't know, slow to react or confused and doesn't know what's going on. That's not normally the case. Look, and I've said this before, for example, during the pandemic, the EU allowed member states to suspend rules on, for example, migration of people to protect their borders because of a pandemic. So there are cases where the EU will say, yes, if you want to break our rules, for a better choice of words, you can do that. There are exceptional cases.
Package that was brought in by the EU means that all railway services have to be subject to privatisation.
Now, this is a little bit frustrating because either Mick doesn't know this or he's pretending not to know. It's not privatisation, it's public tender. Now, the EU says, look, if you're introducing a new rail service or whatever, it has to be a public tender has to be issued. Now, there's a difference between privatization and a public tender. The public tender means that anyone can apply for it, and there has to be transparency, of course. But even a state-owned company can apply to that tender. A private company can, a state-owned company can. Both are treated in the same way.
And they're doing that in France, Germany, Italy and Spain right now.
So there is more wiggle room than perhaps some of your arguments allowed.
There may be wiggle room, but the French and Germans tend to interpret what they do more liberally than we do.
Yeah, but they're members of the same institution. So
yeah,
the RMT's position is driven, because a lot of people are very interested in this. It's driven by the conviction that you couldn't have a programme of full renationalisation under European Union.
Yeah, and I don't think you can. So certainly.
But you can. Now, the question here is, what does Mick believe nationalisation means? Does he mean 100% ownership of a company? Or does he mean 50% plus one of the shares of that company? Now, just think about it for a moment. If there's a private company is having some problems, as we've seen in the past, and the state decides to buy up the shares of that company to a level of 50 plus 1, that means that they have a control of that company. They basically own the company. Now, there are private shareholders as well. Excuse me, there are private shareholders as well. But they have no real influence over what the company does, because the biggest shareholder, the state, control the company. Now, the benefits of this is that if the company later goes on to make a profit, well, the shareholders make some money, but also the state makes some money. Now, maybe what Mick is talking about is how you can't have, and I don't think this is really the case, but that you can't have complete ownership. The state can't completely own the company. Once again, I don't know if the EU forbids that, because there are exceptions where that can take place.
The railways could not be taken into public ownership, or they can only be taken temporarily into public ownership.
But just to get back to this, for example, Scottish Water is owned by the state, and it was owned by the state while the UK was a member of the European Union, and the EU didn't have a problem with that. So apart from railways, there are other entities that are owned by the state while the UK was a member of the European Union. Scottish Water being one example. So this sort of, in a sense, blows his argument out of the water. No pun intended.
Under the fourth railway package. And those packages are going to be brought to all public services. And things like the free movement of labour, which many people appreciate, and I'm not against people moving to get a job, but it also means that you have to inherit the terms and conditions that are brought. So you had what was called the Viking Laval case, where Lithuanian workers were posted into Scandinavia and they brought Lithuanian wages, which obviously undermines the local market. So there are problems about...
But again...
I don't know the details of this, so I'm not going to really respond to it. But once again, I don't see how this is the EU enforcing something. This was a decision made by the government there. So if you want to say this, if you're complaining, well, why didn't the government there have stronger protections? Or you could lobby the EU to say we should have everywhere stronger protections. It doesn't make sense to me to say, well, there's a problem in one part of the EU, so we should actually leave and risk making the situation much worse.
The free movement of labour and capital that undermine collective agreements.
And we're not going to get into a half an hour ding-dong about this.
No.
But you're cherry-picking again. I mean, there are plenty of...
Well, everyone does that.
But some people think you're a refreshing change, Mick Lynch. You can't use the everybody does it defence.
No, but
you can't seriously look at what's happened since 2016 and not regret, in part...
I do regret
that
that there is a Conservative government bringing
What were you expecting?
Well, we were asked in principle, weren't we?
Yes.
Do you approve of the European Union and do you want to remain a member of it? My position is the traditional left position, going back to Peter Shaw and Michael Foot.
Lexit.
Lexit, if we want to call it that. If we'd had the European Community, the EEC, I would have voted to stay in the EEC. I don't personally, and many people in my union, don't believe that Europe should be a sovereign country. I don't believe in a European army, which will come.
No, it won't.
I don't believe...
You know, it's very... I really admire him, but it's very frustrating to listen to this because he's regurgitating arguments that are used by the likes of Nigel Farage, a European army. The UK is a member of NATO. British soldiers have served under foreign generals. But if it's a member of a European army, that's a problem. This is a nonsensical argument.
Let's see. I don't believe...
What's wrong with armies that we're in? There's armies that we're not in that we're supposed to be worried about historically.
Possibly. I don't believe that we should give up much of our fiscal policy to a European state. I was in Ireland at the weekend seeing family, and mortgages are going up in Ireland because of the decisions of the European Central Bank in France.
Okay, once again, it's frustrating to listen to this. This is the European Central Bank. It says here the current rate of interest rates, the current interest rate is 0.75%. If interest rates are rising in banks in Ireland, that's an issue with banks in Ireland. If interest rates are set, yes, the baseline interest rate is set by the central bank, but you can argue with the policy, but this is once again not an argument to leave the European Union. What do you think the Irish Central Bank would be doing at this stage? It's once again, it is a little bit frustrating, but let's continue.
We got the highest inflation in the G7.
Yes, we have.
Largely because of Brexit. Even the Wall Street Journal, which leans to the right, says so.
Well, I saw an economist say it's 50% to do with the oil and gas.
All right, and 48% to do with Brexit.
Well, possibly, and that's a consequence. But
would you go?
Possibly. See, a big problem here is that he's refusing to admit that Brexit is a problem. That Brexit is not driving this rise in inflation. Like, this is reality. You can say, you can admit and say, yes, it is a problem. But I think, all in all, it was better to be out. But he's refusing to accept reality here. It's the reality that costs have gone up because of Brexit. It's more expensive to buy goods from abroad. The pound is weaker because of Brexit. That's driving up the price of imports. Trade is decreasing. It's more expensive for a number of reasons, but Brexit is adding an extra layer that other countries don't have.
Back in if they gave us the option?
We can consider having a relationship with Europe on a better basis than we're going to get, certainly. And if it was the EEC, I would certainly support it.
But it's not going to be the EEC, so you're not going to support it. So, once again, and I'm trying not to get angry here because I have a huge amount of respect for him, but it's frustrating. There is no EEC. It's gone, okay? So you're not going to get back into what's the EEC. Like, people are suffering at the moment because of Brexit. It has made people's lives worse. Directly, you can see a Tory government stripping away the rights that workers had held on to for years. They've been removed. And you have a Tory government that's driving more and more people into poverty. And he's still grabbing on to this Brexit, saying, I have to defend this.
I should go back to Colin because I've got on my hobby horse now. Colin, are you satisfied with that answer?
No, not particularly, because I did hear...
Okay, that's fair enough.
Sorry, Mick.
I accept that. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Mick Truss, Liz Truss and Richie Sunak both said they want to scrap every single piece of EU legislation that's on the books. So...
Yeah, but our employment laws don't sit in EU legislation. So the anti-trade union laws that stop us...
They provide the base, though. And they can go below the base now. You know this.
Yeah, but anti-union laws are not anything to do with the EU legislation. They come mainly...
He's not talking about the anti-union laws. He's talking about protections that are enshrined in law, which does reflect the EU, but they're promising to rip up everything that was inherited from the EU, which is going to make the situation for British workers immeasurably worse.
So we need to get rid of this government.
You get rid of the government and you bring in another government, and then what happens to that government? You have another government. You have another Tory government. Now, I would like to know if Mick Lynch supports first past the post or if he supports proportional representation. But which would be an argument for another day. But it's you're trying to... he has this hope that what'll happen is we just get the Tories out and everything will be wonderful. No, you get the Tories out, and whatever government replaces them will be more friendly to workers and to trade unions. But when they're gone, what do you think is going to happen? The Tories will be back, and they'll be back to their old shenanigans once again. At least when you're in the EU, you have some sort of base. And if there's a problem, you can take it to a higher level. Leaving the European Union took away that support. Now, Mick Lynch obviously knows that. He's not an idiot. He obviously knows that. It seems he just doesn't care.
You shouldn't have voted to give them the power to do it, man.
Well, no, they would have the power to do it anyway, because the deal that they were... Let's not forget that Cameron was elected on a basis of renegotiating the relationship with Europe. So the only way they wouldn't have had the referendum was to get some of those freedoms anyway, which is what...
So we're going back to the, well, if Cameron had got a better deal from the EU. The UK had the best deal with the EU. The EU had said, we can't give you any more. We're undermining the EU by giving you any more. It was the far right within the Conservative Party that kept pushing, we want more, we want more, we want more, until it broke. Until they went, we wanted the moon and the stars. We didn't get the moon and the stars, so we're going to go for a referendum. And unfortunately, and once again I have a huge amount of respect for Mick and the RMT, they told their members, go out and vote to leave. And now we're sitting here talking about how workers' rights have been ripped away by a Brexiteer government. The hardest of Brexits possible, it seems.
The Cameron was elected for.
Maybe. Back to Colin. Sorry, I said I was not going to eat your lunch, and I just did.
Aye, okay. Sorry, Mike. I'm in total disagreement with about EU.
Yeah, that's part of democracy.
There's a golden rule in life. Never trust a Tory, and they are going to demolish every workers' right they can possibly think of, and ones that we even haven't.
And you waved it through.
I waved it as passing by, perhaps. We didn't believe in the EU. We never did. Some of us who have socialist leanings, socialist backgrounds. The priority for me is not to undo history, but to get a different government that's going to strengthen employees' rights. And if I look at what's happening in seafaring, we've had British ratings destroyed while we've been in the EU, and there's not one piece of EU legislation that would have brought back British seafarers.
How many?
Then you should have lobbied the MEPs from your country to go to the European Parliament, to the commissioners, to lobby your commissioner to put forward legislation this was really throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There were things I didn't like about the EU, so let's leave, and to hell with the consequences.
French P&O workers were chucked out without notice by P&O.
But they were a few, but they were not under the. It's not covered by EU legislation. It's covered by the international.
A lot of
maritime.
Irish people telling me their mortgages haven't gone up.
Well, they will be going up because they're going to put the interest rates up.
Okay. Just one final thing to say on this. There are publicly owned companies in the European Union. There are companies that are fully state-owned, and there are companies that are owned with a majority share by the state. His arguments are weak. James O'Brien said you're cherry-picking, and yes, there's a massive amount of cherry-picking here. Is the EU perfect? No, I've never said the EU is perfect. It's deeply flawed in many ways. But you fix those flaws. You campaign to change things. The EU is driven about, I think a core belief within the EU is protecting consumers, trying to provide the best for consumers. For example, here in Italy, railway prices are much cheaper than in the UK. Now, some people will say, well, that's costing workers. I don't think so, because railway workers are well protected by their unions here as well. So, sadly, the UK worker voted for something, and they were told to vote for something by their union bosses. Vote for something that will make everything better, that will usher in a government that will protect workers' rights. And they got the absolute opposite, the complete opposite of that. And sadly, the people who told them are not turning around and saying, actually we were wrong and we're sorry. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.